Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Rokar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive Project. And today I'm delighted to have one of Medici Archive Project's fellows, Eva Schler fellows, David Mesquita, with us, who just finished his fellowship at MAP. He's a PhD candidate at the School of Arts and Humanities of the University of Lisbon, and this is where he's joining us today. And he's going to share his research, parts of his dissertation project, and also the research that he conducted while he was in Florence at MAP. Thank you so much, David, for joining us today and accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the intro, and of course, the Medici Archive Project and its director, Alessia Sonitis, and also the Schler family, so for sponsoring my research stay in Florence. And I also want to extend this thank you to all the members and the staff for the warm welcome in Florence and for all their help in navigating the Florentine archives. And I'm very happy to be here and share my research findings with you and receive feedback that I believe is going to strengthen my research. So let me just share.
Of course, we can't wait.
Screen. Yeah, so it's right here, so everything's fine.
Perfect. Thank you.
So today's presentation focuses on Estêvão Rodrigues de Castro, or known as Stefano Rodrigues Castrensis, or Stefano de Castro in Italy. He was a Portuguese physician who served at Medici Court in the early 17th century. And while I'm guessing he's unknown to the vast majority of you today, Castro was a pivotal figure with a series of avant-garde contributions to atomism and medical semiotics. I believe it's not an overstatement to say that he was the most renowned physician in the first half of 17th century Tuscany after the death of Girolamo Mercuriale in 1606 in Forlì. The traditional accounts of early modern medicine in Tuscany, however, have focused on the 14th to 16th centuries, emphasizing the reformulation of the University of Pisa under Cosimo I in 1543, and also the subsequent attempt to hire renowned physicians such as Andrea Vesalius, or even focused on the years after 1650, highlighting the figures of Francesco Redi or Marcello Malpighi and others. The critical gap in our comprehension of the medical contributions between the end of the 16th and the first half of the 17th century probably results from the fact that scholars have allowed Galileo to overshadow any medical authors of his period. Indeed, the two-volume Storia dell'Università di Pisa, so the history of the University of Pisa, downplays individual medical contributions by oddly dividing the period after 1543 as pre- and post-Galilean. So you can see in the slide, so from 1543 to Galileo and the Pisan environment. After Galileo, the uncertain boundary between Aristotelian libertinism and new science, and also stress Galileo's contributions while ignoring those made by a vast array of medical authors that were his contemporaries. Now, to be sure, attempts have been made to reconstruct medical contributions of the period around Galileo, one of the most recent being the celebrated work by MAP fellow John Anderson in his Florence Under Siege, which focuses on the 1630-1633 plague. And I could cite other works such as Sheila Barker's works on Christine de Lorraine and medical culture in Tuscany. In my research, however, I want to take a different approach by producing an intellectual biography of Castro, whose work still remains largely understudied, by focusing on the impact his contributions seem to have had on fellow physicians such as William Harvey or Paolo Zacchia, who quote or borrow from him, providing us with a testimony of the importance of studying Castro's ideas. The decision to study Castro also stems from the fact that there's still an understudied important group of Portuguese physicians, Sephardic Jewish and New Christians, who had an impact outside Portugal. Prominent among these figures are physicians such as Garcia da Horta, Amatus Lusitanos, Rodrigo de Castro, who is not related to the author I'm studying, Estêvão Rodrigues de Castro, and also Zacutus Lusitanos, to mention just a few. And just a side note, Amatus Lusitanos wrote commentaries on Dioscorides. He also wrote an innovative book called medicinal centuries, which are clinical observations, and the first edition was published in Florence in 1551. It was dedicated to Cosimo I and to the physicians at the newly reopened University of Pisa. Now, this group shared a strong sense of community and was later labeled Lusitani Periti by Zacutus. And it is also from the very same Zacutus, who practiced medicine in Amsterdam, that we get a sense of the importance of Castro, as he called him, the phoenix of medicine. And thus, in my PhD project titled Estêvão Rodrigues de Castro, so Estêvão Rodrigues de Castro, as liber scriptor neque ex Galeni seruis in the controversies of his time, I intend to bring light to a period overshadowed by the figure of Galileo. Now, with this in mind, I've decided to articulate today's presentation into three parts. I'll start by providing a brief outline of the objectives of my research, and next I'll present Castro's life and works, and will explain how the Italian archives helped me to refine this description, and this will be the core of my talk. And lastly, I'll present the reception of Castro's works in Italy and beyond, also in the 17th and 18th centuries. So, in the brief outline of my research objectives, my project aims to clarify Castro's contribution to the medical philosophical controversies of the time. In particular, my research goals are to identify Castro's position and influence on the controversies of the 16th and 17th centuries, and also to contextualize Castro's theories within the medical philosophical landscape of the period, which then will lead me to C, which is to study Castro's contributions to specific discussions, such as that of the nature of women, and also to describe Castro's contributions to disease mutation and the use of chemical procedures, considering the chemical interests of his time, particularly in Tuscany. And finally, E, I aim to trace the possible origins of Castro's ideas and arguments in his Portuguese upbringing, especially linked to the Jesuit scholars who were his masters in Coimbra. Now, thus far, to fully grasp Castro's intellectual contributions, my research has combined an analysis of his works with archival investigation. And while the examination of Portuguese archives provided a foundation for understanding his early career, my research stay in Florence was particularly compelled by the need to clarify key biographical and intellectual details, such as the precise year of his arrival in Italy, the topics of his lectures at University of Pisa, the year of his death, and his reception among his peers. Now turning to Castro's biography and career. So one of the earliest published accounts of Castro's life is an anonymous eulogium published in 1656, which states that Castro was born on November 19th, 1562, and lived up to the age of 78, passing away in 1640. Despite this eulogium, modern scholarship tends to assume Giacinto Manupella's revised timeline after examining an 18th century sepultuario from 1772. In his account, Manupella suggested that Castro was born in 1559, 1560, and that he died in 1638, which I believe was also an attempt to align Castro's age, 78, at the time of death. However, on reading the Cartae Palantes, or dispersed papers published in 1638 by his close friend Paganino Gaudenzi, I suspected the veracity of that information. There, Gaudenzi wrote, and I quote, Stephanus Rodricus Castrensis mortus est anno praeterito. So the translation is, Castro died last year. Now, could his friend be wrong? Was it a typo? My research in Florence's Archivio di Stato allowed me to untie that knot, as I managed to unearth several manuscript information, among which the unpublished testament of Rodrigues de Castro, which allows us to define that he died instead the year before, on the 30th of June, 1637. Additionally, upon consulting a much earlier sepultuario, we also know that he was buried in the central aisle of the Church of Ognissanti in Florence, among other figures such as Sandro Botticelli and Americo Vespucci. And this was the sepultuario by Stefano Rosselli from 1657. And then you can see in the text on the right-hand side in bold that it says, walking towards the Altar Grande, the big altar, by the middle of the church. There's a big marble slab with arms and inscription, Stefano Rodrigo de Castro, etc. And you can see also the Castro family coat of arms as depicted according to Rosselli. So now I just want to take you a step back to Portugal, because Castro lived most of his life in Portugal. He graduated in philosophy in 1584-85 at the Jesuit College of Arts in Coimbra, Portugal. And as it was common in Europe at the time, he studied philosophy as propedeutic to medicine. Of course, he completed at the University of Coimbra in 1588. Now, the period of his life after his graduation and until his departure to France and Italy is not well accounted for. Apart from a few letters showing that he practiced medicine in Lisbon, my recent findings in the Portuguese National Archives also demonstrate that he was a physician of the Portuguese-Spanish Armada in 1606. We know, however, that when he was almost 50 years old, so sometime between 1608, probably around 1609, Castro decided to leave Portugal, perhaps due to the recrudescence of the Jewish persecution. After a short stay in Bordeaux, and I quote, driven by a desire to explore the most illustrious cities of Italy, he settled in Florence, never again returning to his homeland. Now, when did he arrive, and what did he do upon his arrival? Fruit of my map stay, we can certainly define the year of his arrival as 1610. He arrived late in the year, so probably around September, October, or November, judging by the manuscript information contained at the Arte dei Medici. As common in Florence, to practice medicine, one had to be enrolled at the Arte dei Medici. It was a sort of physician's guild. At the time, admission depended on providing proof of degree and passing an exam. Based on the documentation available, it seems that Castro left Portugal in a rush, since he could not bring forth a document proving he had the doctor's degree. As you can see here in the final part, it says, writing the letter, that he does not have the doctor's degree and that he left it in Lisbon when he departed. And so for this reason, he asked to be exempted from this proof and to be tested by an exam. A request Belisario Vinta, a figure to whom I'll come back just below, accepted. Castro entered the Arte dei Medici on the 10th of December, and he passed the examination on the 31st, after which he enrolled in the Arte dei Medici and was authorized to practice medicine in Tuscany. And before this episode, the letter also narrates that he went to the Florentine courthouses to be able to produce to medicate in Florence. So I'm guessing it should be, I haven't found that documentation, but it should have been just a month or two prior to that. Even so, it seems that the Florentine bureaucracy functioned faster than today. It just took him about 2 months at the most to be able to practice medicine. And since the document entered on the 10th of December, he passed the exam and then was able to practice medicine in just 21 days. So after this episode, he started teaching private lessons and also building his network of contacts, which included fellow countrymen such as Rodrigo da Fonseca, who was then professor of theoretical medicine at the University of Pisa. The sources confirm that Castro was held in high esteem and remained a high-profile figure until the end of his life. His reputation rested on 2 pillars, one related to his activity as a physician and the other to his publications. The former can be illustrated by Castro's ability to attract an important clientele, including several renowned patients, such as Belisario Vinta, first Secretary of State, who was one of his very first patients and who visited him on May the 30th, 1613. In Vinta's words, "This morning, after eating, I was struck by one of my attacks, but after the vomit, I'm now completely well. And the Portuguese physician, with aqua santa, very gently helped me to induce the said vomit, which came without alteration and in great quantity. Having then restored me by making me rinse my mouth with an excellent red wine, he insisted that I eat 7 or 8 pieces of Cantucci di Pisa, soaked in fine wine, which brought me back to life. In short, he seems to me a physician fit for princes." Writing to Cosimo II, the recipient of this letter, Vinta testified to Castro's adequacy for higher positions closer to the Grand Duke, as underlined by that final sentence, "He seems to me a physician fit for princes. I believe that more than an account of his state of health, Vinta's assertion importantly acted as a recommendation letter by vouching for Castro's capacities and qualities as a physician. Even more so because the first accounts of Cosimo's illness are precisely dated from May 1613, so just 2 weeks prior. Thus, it comes as no surprise that Castro was eventually called to attend the Grand Duke. And indeed, the crucial moment in Castro's career was in 1616, when he managed to successfully cure Cosimo II, a man whose health had been afflicted since youth by stomach and intestine aches. Cesare Tinghi, chamber aide of the Grand Duke, tells us how this episode unfolded, and I quote, "Wanting to put a hand on medication, His Serene Highness did not want Florentine physicians, but called for Stefano de Castro, a Portuguese physician in Florence." And the treatment lasted for several months. As he continues to narrate, on the 1st of May, having the Portuguese physician prepared steel to give His Serene Highness, composed with rhubarb, ivory, and amber, His Highness took 4 bits of the steel, taken in white wine. On the 25th, after His Highness finished taking steel, the physician Stefano de Castro, Portuguese, gave him a little medicine of Michoacan in a drink. Then, finally feeling better after 5 long months, the Grand Duke endeavored a trip to the house of Loreto in October 1616, and Castro, il medico portoghese, the Portuguese physician, as he was known in Tuscany, was asked to accompany him. And you have here the diary notes of Settimani, who's writing in the 18th century, and he notes that the Grand Duke with his brother, the Cardinal, departed from Florence to the Santa Casa di Loreto to satisfy the vow he made in his last serious illness, and with His Highnesses went the Gentiluomini and the courtiers, that is, with the Grand Duke, and then in the middle we have Il Medico Portoghese. Eventually, this episode of healing or at least temporarily, the Grand Duke, this episode paved the way for Castro's appointment to Grand Duke's Archiater, chief physician, and shortly afterward, in 1617, to the position of Professor of Theoretical Medicine at the University of Pisa, a very prestigious position, as his chair being the first in importance for any medical curriculum. Now, while previously researchers have assumed that there was a cause-effect relationship in this appointment, my recent research noted that, much like the figure of Galileo, Castro was directly nominated by the Grand Duke, as this was attested by the words of the Dean of the University of Pisa, Girolamo della Sommaia, that says that Castro entered the Studio Pisano by His Highness's grace. However, while Galileo was called back, or he asked to be called back to Tuscany in 1610 with a stipend of 1,000 scudi, after having published the Story Messenger, the Desiderius Nuncius, Castro was not famous and had no published work whatsoever in 1616. Thus, the several offerings made to him by Cosimo come across as surprising, namely the initial salary of 700 scudi to teach in primo loco, meaning he preceded other physicians, and also the possibility of teaching any topics he wanted outside the established curriculum for the University of Pisa, which allowed him to teach, for instance, the medicine of women. Furthermore, he was allowed to teach without competition at the University of Pisa's main school, Scuola Grande, and without having to participate in the debates of the Circulus Pisanus. And this was the exemption from the Circulus Pisanus was a prerogative that was only for Castro, as the several letters from Girolamo della Sommaia in Pisa's Archivio di Stato note this is the only one. And the Circulus Pisanus was basically debates between physicians and scholars and students at the time, but Castro was deemed important enough not to participate in this Circulus Pisanus. And just another side note, you can see that Galileo's salary in 1590 was 60 scudi, not 600. And so Castro in 1616, when he was appointed, this position comes across as really surprising because he had no name for himself. Even other letters contained in the Florence State Archive or the Pisan State Archive says by Girolamo della Sommaia, when they are trying to hire professors, they usually note that this professor, for instance, this person has not published enough. This person is not a good lecturer, and Castro did not lecture before 1617. He never lectured, at least public lectures at university. In private, yes, but in public, no. And so such out of the ordinary offers created envy and enmity. As told by Angelo Fabroni, the historian of the University of Pisa in the 18th century, Castro had a famous dispute with Giulio Guastavini, who was then professor of practical medicine at University of Pisa. And I quote, it's the first one in Latin. Guastavini argued sharply and sometimes even fiercely and angrily, especially indulging anger against Rodrigues de Castro, and, according to the testimony of the Academy's curator, that is, Girolamo della Sommaia, such great hostilities arose between these physicians that, had they not been of advanced age, it would have been feared that their conflicts would have had the most unfortunate outcomes. And in fact, several letters held in Pisa State Archive bear witness to this. I'll give just but one example. In a letter dated August 27th, 1619, Girolamo della Sommaia reports to the Grand Duke's secretaries that, I quote, Guastavini now requests to read in the Scuola Grande, where the Portuguese Castro has already taught for 2 years. The reasons he puts forward are that this school is reserved for certain specific lectures, such as ordinary civil law, Greek, and the humanist. Apart from these, it is assigned to senior doctors or lecturers. And since Castro's lecture does not fall into any of these categories, and since Guastavini is senior in both lectureship and doctorate, he believes that the Scuola Grande should be granted to him without any difficulty, senza difficoltà nessuna. Trivial as it might sound, this contention created a climate of hostility which lasted until 1636, the year of Guastavini's retirement, and prevented Castro from achieving the title of sopraordinario earlier in his career. In fact, he only acquired it precisely in 1636, whereas Sommaia's letters demonstrate that he already requested the title since at least 1623. It's interesting to note that he only obtained this title in 1626, and Castro immediately, and he was the last physician, at least according to the Storia dell'Università di Pisa, last physician to have this title. Before him, it was Girolamo Mercuriale. And after obtaining this title, Castro immediately went to the Florentine courthouses to demand that this position granted him the position of being more important than any professor at University of Pisa. So it was just not the physicians. He wanted to be more important than the professors of theology and the professors of civil and canonical law, and he actually was granted that, but unfortunately this decision came on the 30th of June 1637, so the precise day and year of his death. So, but notwithstanding this account of Guastavini bears witness to the unwelcoming reception of Castro among his peers, which was proportional to his rise to political power. Now, reactions against Castro did not rely solely on his institutional prominence, but was a consequence of his published works, some of which departed from the accepted doctrine and mainstream lore of the time. While also being a poet, most of Castro's works covered medical philosophical questions, such as On the Meteors of the Microcosm, published in 1621, the mutation of diseases in 1624 and 27, to that of fasting in 1630, which later ignited the dispute with Fortunio Licetti, a previous professor in Pisa, and that was then in Padua, also to the use of milk serum or the field of gynecology. Overall, Castro's long publishing journey spans from 1617 to 1668, well beyond his passing in 1637, not only because his son took charge of it posthumously, but also because of the interest his oeuvre created in and outside Italy. As can be seen from this list of works, Castro addressed a wide variety of medical philosophical themes, ranging from natural philosophy to medicine, in a period when the classical heritage was still a cornerstone in scholarship and science. And while I do not intend to focus here on Preston's claims, under the protection of the Grand Dukes, Castro was one of the very first physicians to extend the boundaries of the received tradition by running counter the standard curriculum of the time, based as it was on a standardized synthesis of Aristotle's philosophy and Galen's medicine. For instance, instead of the traditional four elements of fire, air, water, and earth, he believed that atomistic theories could provide a more accurate explanation of the natural world. While this is a reflection of the debate, there's still a debate of the minima, this is also a reflection of the renewed interest in ancient atomistic theories in the wake of the rediscovery of works such as Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, and is further sustained by the fact that one of his closest colleagues in Florence, and also a physician, Giovanni Nardi, published an edition of Lucretius's work 10 years after Castro's death in 1647. Castro's rise to prominence and his departure from the standardized curriculum to his published works created many enemies, not only in Florence and Pisa, but also in Padua, Rome, and outside the Italian borders, and led many of them to engage in infamous personal attacks and to downplay Castro's intellectual contributions, as can be seen in this satirical epitaph that was written when Castro was still alive. I'll just stop for a moment for you to read. This was a booklet about 80 pages in octavo. It was published in 1636 by, it was anonymously published, but it was most likely Fortunio Licetti, with whom he had this famous dispute, and his followers. And this book was published in Oldenburg, so in Lower Saxony in Germany. And bear in mind that this is one of the last serious poems against or epitaphs against Castro. Others go through his life to his family, his friends, and so they gathered all that they could and published this defamatory booklet. I believe this created a particular Italian narrative that continued throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, as seen in the likes of 18th century physician and naturalist Tarcioni Tozzetti, writer of one of the most comprehensive histories of scientific advancements in Tuscany. Despite praising Castro at times, Tozzetti often criticizes him. For instance, regarding Castro's treatise on the plague, he remarks, is the first one there, the work is very much of mediocre merit, and it seems that Castro wrote it to justify himself for having been one of those doctors who initially did not believe it to be the plague. And he was all the more blameworthy because he was at the time a consultant for the old magistrate. Or even he characterizes his works as di poca sostanza, so of little substance. Or even the topics or titles of the medical exercitations, which are 30, are beautiful and of great importance in medicine, but the subjects are treated so poorly che fanno pietà. They are pitiful. At the same time, Angelo Fabroni draws a similar criticism of Castro. In 1795, he wrote the following account. Stefano de Castro ascended to such an honor that he appears to have been superior to all the masters of medicine of his time. This is high praise. Then a great fame came down on him as soon as he began to practice medicine, which is attributed not so much to his doctrine or teaching as to his luck. For he is said to have been extremely fortunate in diagnosing the causes of diseases and prescribing remedies. Often, even with simple remedies, he brought relief to illnesses that afflicted the Grand Duke, and from this, his fame, gifts, and other expressions of gratitude ensued. While Fabroni acknowledges Castro's prominence, he seems to downplay his intellectual contributions, attributing his success more to fortune rather to doctrine and a comprehensive understanding of diseases. This critical view was probably rooted in his belief that the anatomic advancements of the later 17th and 18th centuries were necessary to reach the truth. Notwithstanding, the evidence at our disposal confirms that his work was well received by his contemporaries, so physicians and learned people alike. Paganino Gaudenzi, one of Castro's closest friends, writing after his death, stated, Stefano de Castro, an undeniably eminent physician. Today, when fighting a serious and perilous disease, the Florentine nobility demands his works. A further case in point is that of Castiano dal Pozzo, a former servant of the Medici family in Siena, and also one of Galileo's friends and sponsors in Rome, who manifested an interest in Castro's On the Meteors of the Microcosm. In a letter dated November 12, 1623, Dal Pozzo highly praised Castro's work, and I quote, "With a truly golden pen you have written your Meteors of the Microcosm, for it is indeed a book acquiring at any price." He then incited him to remove the typographical errors and to republish his book. The following year, with the Medici family coat of arms on its cover, the Meteors of the Microcosm appeared in Venice, one of the most, if not the most important publishing center of the time, and Dal Pozzo certainly promoted his readership. In the subsequent years, Castro also received a warm readership across learned European circles, as shown by the English William Harvey's letter to the Dutch Johan van Beverwijk, dated April 20th, 1638. Castro enjoyed an international reputation. Harvey writes in a letter, and I quote, "How little Stefano de Castro, physician to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, and your Senate differ from your way of thinking. You will best judge who has perused the institutions of the latter and the books of the on the Meteors of the Microcosm of the former." And the letter continues in a similar vein. Now, of course, you could point out, or you could argue, that the positive impressions that I'm giving about Castro are taken exclusively from the 17th century or from Castro's acquaintances. You could ask if the overall opinion remained favorable beyond that century, and so did he remain an important author afterward? Or do Angelo Fabroni's or Tarcioni Tozzetti's criticisms confirm that he was considered not innovative and not worth studying in the late 18th century? The short answer is yes to the first question. So he was innovative, and no to the second, he was worth studying. I'll just give you an example on his innovation. The famous anatomist Giorgio Baglivi, for instance, writing in 1702, claimed to be introducing a totally new argument on disease succession and mutation. My quote is the Latin text on the right-hand corner: "The argument on the succession of diseases or conversion, that is, the mutation from one into another, is entirely new. Novum omnino est." He later came to regret such a claim, as he was immediately accused of embezzling someone else's ideas. Two subsequent letters revealed that Baglivi later became aware of prior contributions devoted to the same topic, notably those by Castro and by Matthias Tilingius, who published after Castro. Dated from December 1705 and January 1706, these letters show that Baglivi was actively trying to purchase the works of both authors, and you can see he was "Per amor di Dio, in risposta di questa, favorisca di avvisarmi infallibilmente e severamente, detti due libri si trovano costì." So please, by the love of God, please tell me if those books are found there. However, Baglivi died, I believe, in 1707, fairly young, so we never know how he could have engaged with such works. However, Castro's Quae Exquibus, so the book that Baglivi was referring to, also crossed the Italian peninsula into France, where the French father of dermatology, Anne-Charles Laurie, contrarily to Baglivi, immediately recognized Castro's contributions in his treatise on disease mutation, published posthumously in 1784. As the preface to this book remarks, his first intention was to republish Castro with comments, with annotations, but as the annotations grew larger and larger, he decided to publish a new work altogether, while still acknowledging the value of Castro. Most importantly, due to this treatise on disease mutation, Castro crossed the famous divide between pre-modern and modern medicine, usually placed around 1800s. In the 19th century, this physician, who had once been architect to the Grand Dukes of Tuscany, was still important enough to be cited in a medical, not a historiographical context. And now I come just to come to my concluding remarks. through Castro's writings, I hope to have demonstrated today and to demonstrate in my PhD dissertation that the 17th century medical and philosophical traditions deserve to be rediscovered and reinterpreted. His career spanning Portugal, France, and Italy compels us to reconsider physicians as both practitioners and theorists who actively shape debates in several fields of knowledge. By recovering Castro's work, we not only fill a historiographical gap, but also gain an understanding of how medical knowledge was transmitted, debated, and transformed in early 17th century Tuscany and the periods beyond. I'm convinced that by doing so, the links between Portuguese and Italian medicine in the early modern period will become clearer, as will the influence that Castro's work exerted on other geographical and cultural areas. Additionally, a study on Castro also allows us to reckon the role of the Medici patronage in Tuscany more broadly and a different context from that of Galileo. Such research will also bring forth information on other Portuguese working in Tuscany, as there was always a Portuguese physician teaching at the University of Pisa every year from 1564 to 1637, exception made only for the year of 1616. So that's more than 70 years. My project will also serve to include Portuguese physicians in the so-called big picture of early modern science and medicine, as they were continuously left out due to their supposed lack of innovation. And ultimately, in his break with much of the conventional wisdom of his time, I believe that Castro truly deserves the title that Albrecht von Haller gave him and that I've used as leitmotif for my project, that is a free writer and not one of those who are slaves of Galen, liber scriptor neque ex Galeni servis. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, David, for this wonderful presentation of your research. So by now, the Q&A is open for everyone to write their questions. And I already see one question by Gaston. Thank you, David, for your great lecture. What do you think is the most innovative feature of Castro's scholarship? And why has his figure been largely overlooked by today's historians of medicine?
Thank you so much for the question. So it's a great question. So I think the first, it's hard to pinpoint, but certainly is turned to atomism and the rejection of the Aristotelian theories, which I believe is the root cause of his works on disease mutation, because he sees matter as flowing and as particulate, which allowed him to hypothesize this, that diseases transform into one another. And I believe this is rooted in his atomism. So I think that's the most important point. Now to the second, I actually I do not know. I believe that in part historians on the period around like the early 17th century focused on more experimental and experimentalism, such as with the figures of Galileo and Castro. For one, he was not the person of making those experimentations and bringing forth instruments. He was more of a theoretical person, so I think partially is due to that.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Yes. So now my question is that actually is somehow related, but how did you come across Castro, and why did you decide to lead a whole dissertation on this figure and his contributions to the early modern, medicine?
Yeah, so my background, so before coming to the humanities, in high school, I did the scientific background, and then I went to classical studies and studying the classical tradition. But when I came across going to the PhD, I've talked with the person in Lisbon, who's now my supervisor, Bernardo Mota, about the possibility, because he had a project on the other Castro, Rodrigo de Castro, was in Hamburg in Germany at this project, and we shared some ideas, and he told me about this author Castro, and I started reading about him, and he really, this is going from Portugal into Italy, it really startled my mind, because my background also I also did a bit of that, because in my master's degree, I went to study in Italy. So I was really interested in studying the Portuguese-Italian connections, and specifically in this area, so in the scientific area. And so I came across with medicine and then Castro. So
Right, right. Yeah. So there is always, a personal connection.
Yeah.
So how do you think that your research addresses the broader context of early modern medical education or knowledge transmission?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So regarding education, from what I gathered in the Pisa's Archivio di Stato, I was really startled because Castro started to teach on topics outside of the traditional curriculum. So traditional curriculum, you had to read Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, and he started to teach topics that he wanted, and specific lectures, for instance, on the members of women, on the nature of women. So we kind of see that there's a shifting focus in the 17th century also to that, just to address this sort of new interest in the medicine of women, for instance. And so it kind of and he has a treatise on that published in 1654 regarding is the transmission. Castro was only edited, for instance, in the 17th century, but he gathered lots of. He was edited first by his son, but then he was edited in France and particularly in Germany. He was edited several times and re-edited or republished in Germany. And you can see some of the authors, like for instance Stahl, to whom Castro exerted some influences. So you can see that Castro, coming from Portugal, and he had a Jesuit education, so we had an Aristotelian education, and then you went into Italy, where, for instance, theories of Paracelsus, or at least in Tuscany, where the theories of alchemy and Paracelsus were welcomed, particularly in Tuscany. So I think Castro is really interesting because it's a mixed match of all these theories. He received this Aristotelian background. He went to Italy. He's an adept. He's not fully Paracelsian, but he respects the findings of Paracelsus, and he then is diffused into France and into Germany. So I believe this sort of pans out a bit of the map of Europe, but also importantly, Castro's works, and I believe the Portuguese at the time had some sort of exoticism, so to speak, because they went to the New World, and they gathered information from other parts of the world. For instance, Castro in his work talks about the pineapple, and the pineapple was not a commodity in the period. And it says pineapple is able to destroy iron, and so nobody, or probably almost nobody in Tuscany at the time, had ever seen a pineapple. So you can see how this knowledge travels through time as well, and geographical areas. So I think that's a really interesting feature in Castro and the Portuguese in that period.
Right. Yes. And what an interesting example.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my next question is about the primary resources that you worked with, both in Florence and now that you're back in Lisbon. What sorts of primary resources are you dealing with for this research?
Yeah, so mostly I'm going through Castro's works. So he had more than 20 published works. I'm going to the first major works, which has the features of the microcosm. So I'm just reading his text and making lots of annotations. And secondly, I'm also working with the archival resources. And when I was in Florence, I took hundreds, if not thousands, of pictures to come back to Portugal and start transcribing them as I can into time. But most importantly, I'm just doing a close reading of Castro's text. That's the main, or the core of my research.
Okay, so and are there any documents on their reception of his works, even in the later periods?
Yeah, absolutely. It was until the 19th century, and this until the end of 19th century, several physicians quote Castro. So I've already gathered more than perhaps 50 physicians that quote him and draw from his ideas, as Castro was the first, or at least was recognized as being one of the first to talk about disease mutation, and importantly, was one of the very first to talk about metastasis, and that's really important in medicine, and that's why people quote him mainly in the 18th and 19th century. So his ideas, for instance, his atomistic ideas were kind of left aside, but his works on disease mutation were still important to be read in the 19th century. So I think that's also a really interesting and important figure that I'm going to deal more towards the end of my degree. Now I'm focusing mainly on his theories and also writing about this reception of Castro in the 18th, 19th century, but it's a work in progress, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So, so what kind of challenges did you have to deal with, especially when you were in Florence at the archive, or even other, collections? What are the challenges of your research?
Yeah. So I believe, for instance, in Florence, I think the most the challenges were that I was looking like for information for a specific figure. You have like several fonts in the activity stat on the map. Members helped me a lot, but I'm just looking for a specific person and a specific information related to this specific person. And when you're reading to the documentation there, you get lots of information regarding like the Medici family, etc. And so like finding a needle in a haystack, so to speak. So we have to lose several hours until I find one specific letter or his testament, for instance. But in the end, it's worthwhile. But I think that's the biggest challenge, because if you are looking, for instance, to in the after the Medici, and you are studying a period from, for instance, from 1620 to 1630, you gather the information, of course, depends on your research questions, but the information that's there, it's going to be useful to you, or most of the information, because you are studying a specific font. But when you're studying a specific person, then it really narrows down, and there's lots of hours searching for information regarding that person. And then, of course, the difficulty is that these texts, for at least, would not are not translated, and I come from a classics background, and I can fairly deal with Latin text, but sometimes, at least in the beginning and still a bit now, the medical texts tend to be dense. So the prose, sometimes it's really beautiful, and I must say it's really beautiful, but sometimes it's really dense as well. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And do you know if Castro was known or recognized in any other um, languages other than, Western European or like Italian,
Language.
outside of this world?
So if he was received, well, I'm not sure. So you're talking about Mexico, or the new world, or you are
The
referring
new,
to?
yeah, in any other languages, any other communities, was he recognized?
As far as I know, now, no. I haven't come across, when I was looking through his reception, it's mostly in Europe. So it's in French, for instance, but it's in Europe. I haven't found yet anything, for instance, rating like or Brazil or Mexico, or his reception in those fields. He was also recognized as a good poet, because he published in 1623, while his son published his book of rhymes, and he was
Mhm.
recognized poet in the 17th century. But that's not my focus. But yeah, he was recognized as that, and he also wrote on friendship. He has two books on friendship, and was dedicated, for instance, to Cassiano dal Pozzo and the Cardinal Barberini in Rome. But yeah, mostly I've only seen in Europe.
Okay, thank you. And so let's, shift our focus to your dissertation. So what are the other, I know that you are now focusing on this one figure, but what is the major idea in your major theme in your dissertation, and what are the other chapters?
Yeah, so basically, I'm going through Castro's work, and basically the basic setting is intellectual biography, and to frame him in the interests in women's medicine, so in gynecology, but also in alchemy, and also how he received other works in his own work. For instance, he cites, of course, Galen and Hippocrates and other works from Petro Severinus, who was a Danish physician who had this idea of seeds. So the central figure of my thesis and is about Castro, and I'm aiming to write an intellectual biography of Castro and also to frame him in the larger disputes of the time, both on atomism, but also, for instance, on fasting. He had a famous dispute in the 17th century with Fortunio Licetti. So the central figure is Castro, and I'm going to the figures he engaged with, the topics he has engaged, and trying to read also the works of other authors and see how we engage with them. So trying to give a big picture of the 17th century debates, but focusing on the figure of Castro and its ramifications there.
Right. So you are also having this kind of comparative analysis of this figure within the broader network of, other figures active in medical education in the early modern period or in the 17th century.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's mainly a study on Castro, but also on how he had these dialogues, and that's why, and also the project title is in the controversies of each time, because his works are usually framed. This is also scholastic, so to speak, but his works are framed a lot as disputations, and he has lots of disputations with other physicians, and perhaps not like today when perhaps someone dies, we do not have an active disputation with this specific person. But in the 17th century, you had active disputation with other physicians. It might be with Hippocrates, it can be with Galen, but it can be also with people that were just writing 100 years later. So he was having an active dialogue with them, and he kind of joins, and there's a dialogue with several traditions. So there's the Greek tradition, that's the Arabic tradition, and there's also the alchemical tradition where the focus is Paracelsus. And so he has all these dialogues, and I'm trying to see how he frames himself and how his ideas have impacted medicine in the long run. Of course, most of his ideas were wrong, at least to today's standards, but it's interesting to see where do ideas come from, and how they are shaped by these people, and how their minds frame these ideas, and where they led to in the end in 17th and 18th and 19th centuries.
Right. There's actually another question by Gaston. Can you tell us something about Castro's medical theory and practice? Is there any correlation, or do they go separate ways? As some contemporary scholars argue was largely the case in the early modern period.
Yeah, that's also a great question. Thank you, Gaston. Yeah, it's true. So there's in Castro, and I believe to some extent in many physicians, so it's hard to bridge the gap between theory and practice, even because when I was talking, for instance, about atomism and particles, when you are facing a situation with a specific person in front of you who can be a lay person, you are not going to explain the illness by means of, particles. You have these atoms, X and Y. And in Castro, what I've seen, and of course, I haven't found Castro's own writings so medical prescriptions, but from the narrations, for instance, of Cesare Tinghi, it does seem that it does not change that much from there seems to be a difference between his theory and his practice. His practice seems to be conservative to some extent, but also innovative to another extent. For instance, when he brings medicines of the New World, so this medicine of Michoacan, which was a root found in Mexico. So he seems to be open to these sort of new remedies, but it does not correlate these sort of new remedies, at least from what I've read so far. it does not correlate these remedies to his theories. So there seems to be a divide between his theory and this practice. Yeah, so, but I'm trying to bridge that gap and see if there's a more specific correlation, but so far there seems to be this gap that I cannot bridge it.
Right. Okay, and speaking of this gap, my next question is about how does your research, how does your study measure the impact of Castro's writing, despite all the gaps and obscurities?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So by measuring the impact, I believe I was trying to see and to frame it well in the known studies that are in such figures such as William Harvey. So William Harvey, perhaps most of you know, but he was in the person demonstrated in 1628, for instance, that blood circulated. And when you see that Harvey cites him, it's interesting to see why and what is the reason. Some questions I do not have the answers yet, but it seems to have an active impact in the dialogues that were happening in the time, specifically in the time. So, for instance, once again, returning to Fortunio Licetti and that of fasting, which was an important topic. So, for instance, Licetti argued that it was possible to live without eating for an extent, and Castro said, well, that's not possible. Otherwise, people and the argument of Licetti was that people could breathe the smell of the food, and Castro said that was impossible, that could not happen. And for instance, Tarcioni Tozzetti, when he's writing in the 18th century, he marks that sometimes this Portuguese person was correct. So yeah, he had an impact in his own time, but I believe he had a longer lasting impact into the 18th and 19th centuries, because from what I found in the period, you have some friends mentioning him and his theories, but for instance, atomistic theories that were discussed by Daniel Sennert, by other authors such as Pierre Gassendi, they do not seem to cite him. I was searching in Leibniz, I was searching in other authors, and they do not cite him. So I believe to some extent there was sort of and this Italian narrative by the group of Fortunio Licetti that managed to cover Castro's findings, and he was very welcomed, for instance, in Germany. In Germany, it was well received. It was republished and re-edited in Germany, but it was afterwards. So there's a gap, for instance, of 100 years when Castro returned, and mostly is because of this treatise on disease mutation, even though he was one of the first physicians to talk about atomism and going against Aristotle's theories, but he was overshadowed by Daniel Sennert and authors such as Pierre Gassendi. So yeah, I believe in the long run a bit of impact, but not many in the 17th century.
Right. Yes. And I promise this is my last question because we only have 2 minutes. So how do you hope your research, because I know you're still in the middle of this research and it's not a done project. I don't think any project can be really done, but anyway, because you're still in the middle of your research, how do you hope for this study to engage with the current, scholarship on this, intellectual history and, history of medicine in the early modern period?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yeah, I believe in my contribution, or my intended contribution, is to demonstrate in a sort of way, because also the Portuguese were kind of left outside of this big picture of early modern science and medicine. So they are, and you were asking in the beginning about the challenges. Also, there's so little bibliography on Portuguese medicine in the 16th and 17th centuries. So what I aim to intend in my thesis is, through the figure of Castro, also integrate this Portuguese group of physicians in a larger dialogue of 17th century history of medicine and their findings, if their findings or not contributed to a vaster dialogue that helped us arrive in the 18th and 19th centuries in medicine. So that's one of my main goals.
Right. Yes,
Mhm.
that's absolutely invaluable. And good
Yeah.
luck with that. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for sharing your research and knowledge with us so generously. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you joined an hour early because of the time change due to daylight saving, thank you. And I hope to see you all again next week. Same time, same link, and until Europe also applies the daylight saving, and then we go back to the normal hours. But until then, I will see you same time, same link, hopefully next week. And David, thank you so much again for joining us tonight. Have a great
Thank you.
evening. Bye
Thank
bye,
you. Bye bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.